The World Annual Climate Summit is underway. Can countries meet their emissions targets? Do they go far enough to stop global warming? This is Roundtable with me, Vanessa Cuddiford. The goal is to cap global warming at 2 degrees or less, but a new report from the UN says current pledges to reduce emissions barely cover what's needed. So, do the world's biggest polluting countries and industries need to take more responsibility?
Donald Trump's America, casting a lonely shadow at the COP23 climate summit. Nations have been reaffirming their pledges to the Paris Accord and reflecting on the US withdrawal. The rest of the world moving toward unity in the face of climate change.
وأنا أؤكد أن الجمهورية العربية السورية تدعم تنفيذ اتفاق باريس لتغيير المناخ.
But the world's new climate agenda is anything but certain. And skeptics believe it might not be ambitious enough to bring about real change. 2017 is set to be among the hottest 3 years on record. The global average temperature is 1.1 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Prompting concerns, the Paris Agreement will fall short of its goals. What does the US absence matter if the plan was always doomed to fail? This year's UN Environment Emissions Gap Report has rung alarm bells.
We no longer have the luxury of time.
We need to rapidly reduce emissions.
We must not fail our people.
The report warns that pledges in the Paris Agreement covers only 1/3 of emissions reductions needed, and that the gap between what's required and the national pledges made in Paris is alarmingly high.
Our world is in distress from the extreme weather events caused by climate change. Destructive hurricanes, fires, floods, droughts.
Negotiations to close the gap are likely to be difficult. The US has already set a precedent for countries who feel the terms are unfavourable. The Warsaw Mechanism is a fund to help countries experiencing the worst effects of climate change, offering $100 billion worth of loss and damage payments. But there's disagreement over how it should be spent. Big polluters expect money to be spent on mitigation, making changes to reduce emissions. But small, developing nations want to spend the funds on adaptation, overcoming current adverse climate conditions. Fiji is one such nation. Climate change means Fiji is dealing with rising sea levels, increased storm intensity, ocean acidification, and damaged ecosystems. But Fiji's emission readings could not be further from the world's leading polluter, the United States. If stopping and then reversing climate change is to be an achievable goal, targets set by the Paris Accords will have to be raised. That will require a cohesive strategy, one that will ask much of the Accord's signatories.
Well, I'm joined today from the COP23 Climate Summit in Bonn by the Director of Strategy at the Union of Concerned Scientists, Alden Meyer. Also there is climate law specialist Megan Bowman. With me at the round table is the author of Climate Change in World Politics, John Vogler, Madeleine Cuff, Deputy Editor of the climate news website Business Green, and we have Guy Shrubsole. He's a campaigner with Friends of the Earth. Thank you all for joining me. I'm going to come to you first, John, and talk about that issue of emissions targets. Do we need to be more ambitious? Should they be mandatory?
I can only agree with that, and it would be nice if they were mandatory, but I think we have to remember that the the difference between the Paris Agreement and the Kyoto Agreement. The Paris Agreement is comprehensive, but it's essentially voluntary. That is to say, countries set their own nationally determined contributions, and I would stress the word contributions, not commitments. And these are inadequate, and I think it is widely recognized that there has to be a ramping up of ambition. And the Paris Agreement is structured in order to make that happen. So that's the critical point.
Alden, you're at the climate summit in Bonn. Do you sense that there's agreement there that those targets need to be more ambitious?
There's an understanding that we have to do quite a bit more if we're going to meet the Paris temperature limitation goals. The problem, of course, is that no country is willing to say that they're going to do more. For example, the United Nations report said if we stay on the path we're on, we'll only get 1/3 of the way to where we need to be by 2030 to meet the 2 degrees temperature goal, much less the more ambitious 1.5 degrees Celsius goal agreed to in Paris. So that's the challenge. You have to convince all the major emitters, including my country, the United States, that more has to be done in the next 10 or 11 years if we're going to get back on track, and that's a very tall order.
Well, indeed, particularly because the United States, Donald Trump, the president, has said that he wants to withdraw from Paris. How important is that?
I mean, I don't think anybody is going to argue that Trump withdrawing the US from the Paris Agreement is unimportant. It's certainly a huge statement from the US, but I think it's worth noting that every other country who has signed up to the Paris Agreement, and that now includes Nicaragua and Syria, have said that they will stick to the targets and they will stay in. So it is a big deal, but the US is looking very isolated in its decision. It hasn't brought with them a group of countries that have also said that they would renege. Okay, so isolated internationally. Megan, internally, though, in the US, how isolated is Trump? What is industry and those bodies that aren't federal bodies? How do they feel about it?
So there is very much a sense that the private sector and non-state actors are involved in this process in a meaningful way. And we're actually seeing those particular actors respond to political messaging in a really robust way. So, for example, in the US alone, there is essentially a coalition of concerned businesses and investors in a group called We Are Still In. And the message very much from that group of businesses and investors that essentially have $2.5 trillion of assets under management. The message from that group is let us support the Paris Agreement, let us move this forward, and that we can assist in that process. So the private sector certainly and these non-state actors are moving forward regardless.
We've got, for the first time, Fiji presiding over this conference, and it's having to be held in Bonn because it can't be held in Fiji because they're still recovering from a cyclone, a climate event. How much of this responsibility lies with the big developed nations, and how much with those nations like Fiji, which really are at the front line?
Well, clearly the developed world, the rich nations of the world, have a huge responsibility to be picking up the tab for climate change, not only in terms of cutting emissions far faster than we have been so far, but actually also providing more in the way of finance for developing countries to both mitigate, cut emissions, but also to protect themselves from the climate change that we're already seeing and against future climate change in the pipeline. And there's a huge dialogue going on at the moment about loss and damage. And loss and damage is a process by which basically countries that are in the front line of climate change, like Fiji, like low-lying island states, like sub-Saharan Africa, want to see, quite rightly, money being given essentially in recompense for climate change damages already suffered. And a lot of developed countries, rich countries, are really stonewalling against that. They're not prepared to pay that sort of money, but we have a huge historical responsibility really for doing so. The UK, for example, obviously the country that really started the Industrial Revolution, started coal burning in a major way. Really, we should be stumping up far more money and not just trying to pretend that we can use existing overseas aid as a means to pretend that we're giving money for loss and damage.
Yeah, and Fiji, for example, over the next 10 years will need to spend an amount equivalent to 1 year's GDP to build resilience, John. That's impossible for a small island nation.
Yes, I mean, this is this is, as you rightly say, it's all about denial of liability, and this is a horribly complicated issue. To assign responsibility for something like climate change over 100 years or more is so difficult. And of course, it's very easy for countries to simply deny it and refuse to say it. I remember the US delegate just before Paris says, if equity is in, we're out, he said, I seem to recall. So the whole issue of assigning responsibility is so difficult. You can do it in various ways. You can say there ought to be an overall carbon budget, carbon space, and we in developed countries have used up most of our allocation of the carbon space. Therefore, we should cut our emissions, and countries like India should be allowed more emissions up to a safe level. That's only one way of doing it, and of course, it's very difficult for politicians with their national interests, with their electorates, listening to what they do, to make grand gestures, to be generous on these issues. They tend to pursue their own national interest.
And this question of climate finance, where to direct those funds, is a big one at the Bonn conference. Alden, to your way of thinking, is it adaptation that we need to be focusing on, or mitigation?
We actually have to be focusing on mitigation to drive down the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, but we have to also acknowledge that no matter how successful we are on mitigation, there are going to be severe impacts from climate change because of the emissions we put up over the last century. We have to help countries prepare to cope with those. There's also going to be what's called loss and damage, which the inevitable devastation on island states, vulnerable countries that cannot adapt to the kind of changes that we're seeing and are going to need assistance to rebuild their economies after typhoons, after floods, after droughts. And that is a very charged political topic here because that could be quite expensive on top of the money that developed countries need to provide to help developing countries to mitigate and adapt. They need to also help them deal with the damages that are coming in the next several decades, no matter what we do at this point.
Yeah, and a lot of the emissions that are being created in developing countries like India, for example, a lot of that has been outsourced from developed nations, hasn't it?
Well, yes,
Evelyn?
of course. I mean, as the developed world's economies have become more based on service industries, there has been a kind of shift from the more industrial emissions over to places like India and China. But I think it's also worth noting that both India and China are investing heavily in renewable energy. China has mothballed 150 coal plants in the last couple of months. India has kind of gone full steam ahead on solar power. So although they are kind of the hotbeds for some of the most intensive industrial emissions, they are also some of the biggest supporters of renewable energy in the world. So they are doing their best to kind of try and clean up their act, but also grow their economies at the same time. So it's a really tricky kind of political dynamic to manage.
And Megan, the fact that places like China and India are investing in these renewable technologies, well, that makes them cheaper for everyone, doesn't it?
Essentially, we're reaching a point now where some of these technologies are on par with traditional fossil fuel sources. So that is true. And certainly the investment community is being rallied around those kind of targets, yes.
Okay. Let's talk about the thorny issue of carbon credits, where someone essentially pays if they need to, for example, take a flight, they would pay for another organisation to not use the equivalent amount of carbon, and therefore that flight would be carbon neutral. How do you feel about those, Guy?
Well, I think Friends of the Earth's position on this has long been that look at how market-based schemes like emissions trading has really failed to do very much to reduce emissions at all anywhere in the world. It's great that obviously there are policies in place to try to reduce emissions and that market mechanisms are amongst those. But if you look at how the EU, for example, has tried to make an emissions trading scheme work, I mean, what are we at? €7 a tonne of carbon or CO2 at the moment in the EU? That's hardly biting on a carbon emitting plant. And in the UK, we've actually done something which is slightly better, only marginally better, but slightly better, which we've introduced a carbon price floor, which has raised the price of carbon on some of the most carbon polluting plants. And that has started to see things like coal driven off the system, driven off the grid. So essentially, really you need to see a lot more state intervention, a lot more use of just simple forms of regulation rather than creating huge complex new mechanisms that give the illusion of activity but actually in the end just end up moving around lots of credits and creating new markets where we just need to be reducing it and using tougher mechanisms to do that.
Okay, so a lot more state intervention. How realistic is that?
Well, that's the problem, isn't it? I mean, I do agree on the whole business of carbon credits. I mean, if you put this in a historical perspective, I think this all started at a period when kind of neoliberal economics was very much in vogue. And you can see this running in parallel, really, with the development of the Climate Change Convention. Now I think we're beginning to think more rather differently, and I think it does require, and it will require, pretty major state intervention. Particularly in the context of some of the consequences of climate change that we're thinking about. I mean, the other thing I'd say about this the whole adaptation mitigation thing is that it's pretty fundamental to continue with the Climate Change Convention in the sense that the developing nations are not going to play ball. They're not going to continue with this unless they do get adaptation money and the GCF, the fund, because there is a kind of underlying deal on this. Which I think has been important. And if you look back on the history of the Climate Change Convention, originally it was all about mitigation, but now adaptation is up there, I think, adaptation and loss and damage. And that will keep that is essential if you're going to keep the developing world on board, because it's really part of a much bigger north-south, I'm not sure what I call it, a dialogue, but confrontation in some ways. And you should really see the Climate Change Convention as part of that.
Yeah. Alden, we're 2 years after Paris now. We're now writing the rules for Paris, aren't we, at the Bonn Convention? What are those rules going to have to be, do you think?
Well, they're going to have to show how we implement and strengthen Paris over time. So in implementation, we need to know how well countries are doing in meeting the commitments they set out in their nationally determined contributions. So transparency, reporting, independent verification of all countries is important. We also need to set the accounting rules for these new market mechanisms that were established under Paris to allow countries to cooperate in meeting their commitments. And most importantly, we need to lay the groundwork for serious ramping up of emissions reductions over the next couple of years as we get to 2020, which is when countries have to finalize or increase the level of their commitments under Paris. And as I said earlier, if we leave everything locked in stone through 2030, we're going to be way off track and we'll be heading for a world of 3 degrees or 4 degrees, not well under 2 degrees.
And Megan, to what extent do you sense that the nations there are keen to meet these rules that Alden's talking about and to be transparent about it?
So I think there's a huge appetite for it. The international community is behind this agreement. The difficulty is, of course, that there are some historical and cultural sticky points in this particular agreement on exactly those issues that Alden mentioned. And particularly, we're getting the sense that in 2 particular areas which will be essential for going forward, being finance and technology, that there's a sense of movement in technology and sort of coalition and unison in relation to technology, but finance is causing a lot more friction.
But Megan, when we involve the private sector, they're obviously self-interested, aren't they? They're motivated by profit. That's a problem, isn't it, when we're talking about things that really, aren't about profit?
Well, I mean, in many ways, the Paris Agreement presents an opportunity that we haven't really experienced before to this level in terms of bringing private and public sectors together to interact, to collaborate, to actually help each other. And we haven't really seen that level of necessity in any international agreement before, perhaps with the Montreal Protocol, but to a lesser degree. So it certainly presents challenges. These 2 sectors don't readily speak each other's language. They don't readily understand each other's logic. But there's very much a sense that they're going to have to sort it out because this is required to implement the Paris Agreement. So I think that will be an area of both challenge and opportunity. But what we're seeing with the private sector is that there are, particularly with mitigation, there are business case or risk and return reasons for getting involved. Adaptation is a lot stickier because essentially the kind of returns that one gets through a number of adaptation measures are social returns, they're community benefits, they're not financial returns. And that, particularly in adaptation, will require public or government interventions to motivate and incentivise and leverage and mobilise the private sector. It's really in adaptation, I think, that we're going to see probably both the most sticking points as well as the most opportunity for interaction and collaboration between public and private sectors, two sectors that don't naturally sit with each other.
John, I can see you're agreeing there with Megan.
Yeah, well, this gets to the point of the whole business. I mean, what is the point of the Paris Agreement? The point is, I think, not that governments on their own can really do much about this. The point is to set certain benchmarks, certain expectations for the mainly for the private sector, as to what the situation is going to be in relation to investments in the longer term. So if you ask what is the point of it all, then I think that is probably the answer. That above all else, you've got to set benchmarks for the future.
Set benchmarks, but these benchmarks
Yes.
have been voluntary, haven't they? So really, what is the point of these meetings? It's just a lot of talk, isn't it, Guy?
Well, that's the fear. But I think that it's a vital place to be having essentially an attempt to have a democratic discussion, uniquely almost amongst international agreements, a space for all nations to come together, not for it just to be done through the UN Security Council and through the sort of the world's self-appointed elite, but a way that actually all nearly 200 nations can come together and talk about this and come to an agreement together. And obviously, what we did see with Paris, inadequate as in many cases it was still a historic agreement that did, I think, and has continued to give momentum to national level action. And for example, the commitment in it to not only try and cut emissions to meet a 2-degree target, but to strive towards 1.5 degrees for the first time, is something that we're seeing in the UK as Friends of the Earth, trying to campaign on that, to be able to bring that back to national governments and obviously governments around the world to say, look, you need to be committing to this. You've committed to the Paris Agreement. It was this amazing agreement that everybody signed up to, heads of state travelled to Paris to sign up to. Now what are you doing about it? Now what are you doing about it at the national level? And I think that is starting to have some impact. But we need to see much more action pre-2020, which is something that I've been hearing about that's been at this last week's dialogue at the COP, has been sort of pushed off the table. And we need to see real progress on that in the coming week.
Yeah, I mean, all these countries have signed up to it, as you say, but of course then the US withdrew. Could we see other countries follow suit, Madeleine?
I think that was the real fear. These summits are held annually, and so last year's was in Marrakesh, and that happened during the US election. So everybody woke up in Marrakesh to hear that Donald Trump was president, and there was a real fear that we'd kind of see a domino effect. But that doesn't seem to have kind of taken place. In fact, there was a very strong reaction from lots of countries to say, actually, no, we condemn Donald Trump for this decision, and we will keep going on regardless. So I think that danger has passed. I think what the kind of the more interesting discussion is around how we kind of keep that level of peer pressure up without a party as big as the US there to help drive the process forward. And that will require states like the EU and China and those other big hitters to really step up to the plate and drive that momentum forward in the absence of US involvement.
Back to Bonn, and Megan, what's your main hope for what can be achieved at COP23?
It's a big question. It's a huge question. I'd like to focus in on the public-private sector collaborations. I'd like to focus in on that because I think that's where the momentum and movement is really on the ground in relation to finance and technology particularly is going to happen. So I really hope that we can essentially push that collaborative agenda forward.
And do you think the fact that Fiji's presiding over this gives this an urgency that perhaps we haven't seen before when these have been held in developed nations?
Yes, I agree, because one of the amazing things about the Climate Change Convention is that the Alliance of Small Island States and countries like Fiji have had a really disproportionate influence, and that gives me a certain amount of hope, you know, amidst all the politics and national interest. The fact that they can take a really strong moral stance on this has been significant. They've been disproportionately influential, I think.
And how hopeful then, Guy, are you that we might be able to aim for this 1.5% temperature rise rather than the 2% that was originally put forward?
Well, we have to be hopeful, obviously. What we need for increased action, particularly from developed countries, from rich nations, before 2020. We can't have just simply sitting back and resting on our laurels to think that we've somehow got the Paris Agreement and that's it. We need to start implementing it. We need to start doing stuff far quicker and far faster. We need to see rich countries doing far more to pledge finance for not only mitigation and adaptation, but also for loss and damage, to pay the countries that are being hit by climate change, worst of all, for those damages. And really, yeah, we need to see people stepping up across the board, and as other people have talked about, increased activity from the private sector as well, incentivised by these new laws and regulations that people are starting to put in place around the globe.
Okay, an ambitious note to end on. Thank you all so much for joining me. So, can the world's biggest carbon emitters step up and take more responsibility? And if they do, will it be enough to deal with a problem that many consider to be the most urgent that the world faces? That was Roundtable with me, Vanessa Cunderford. Thank you for watching.